Is that supposed to be lunch? Richard Whitmore said it softly, almost carelessly, but the words traveled across the dining hall like a fork dropped on marble. For one full second, every conversation inside St. Gabriel Academy stopped. The silverware stopped clinking. The children at the long oak tables stopped chewing. Even the string quartet hired for the donor luncheon seemed to lose its rhythm, the violin bow hovering above the strings as if the music itself had been embarrassed into silence. Richard stood near the center aisle in a charcoal suit that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month, his white hair brushed neatly back, his polished shoes reflecting the gold light from the chandeliers above. He had come to announce a $20 million nutrition initiative under the name Whitmore Foods, a program wrapped in glossy brochures, smiling children, and carefully chosen words like dignity, opportunity, and wellness. The cameras were already there. The school board was there. Parents in tailored coats sat along the side walls, whispering over sparkling water and tiny plates of roasted vegetables. Everything had been arranged to look generous. Everything had been arranged to look clean. Then Richard had seen the little black girl at the end of the third table. Maya Brooks was 8 years old, though from a distance she looked smaller, not because she was weak, but because she held herself carefully, as if she had learned not to take up space that adults might decide was not hers. Her hair was braided into 2 neat rows tied with faded yellow beads. Her uniform sweater had been washed so many times the navy had softened into gray at the elbows. In front of her sat a blue plastic lunchbox with a cracked white latch, the kind sold in grocery stores beside paper towels and discount notebooks. The lid had popped open when she set it down, revealing half of a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper, 3 apple slices turning brown at the edges, and a small carton of milk with the corners slightly bent. It was not the sort of meal that belonged in the glossy brochure Richard's team had printed. It did not photograph well. It did not flatter the room. And because Richard Whitmore had built an empire by controlling how things looked, he reacted before kindness had time to reach him. A few adults gave nervous laughs, not because the comment was funny, but because powerful men often trained rooms to laugh when they did not know what else to do. Maya looked up at him. Her eyes were dark, steady, and far too calm for a child who had just been made the center of a rich man's joke. She did not cover the lunchbox. She did not push it away. She placed one small hand on the cracked lid, almost protectively, as if the meal inside had a heartbeat. Across the room, Principal Eleanor Hayes moved quickly toward them, her smile tight with panic. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, lowering her voice, "Maya is one of our scholarship students. She is a wonderful child." Richard barely glanced at her. His attention stayed on the lunchbox. "I'm sure she is," he replied. "But if this academy is asking my foundation to fund healthy meals, perhaps we should begin by admitting what unhealthy choices look like." Another hush rolled through the hall, colder this time. A boy sitting 2 seats away from Maya stared down at his polished loafers. A woman near the windows pressed her lips together. Someone from Richard's public relations team shifted uncomfortably beside the photographer. Maya's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, but her voice, when it came, did not shake. "It's not unhealthy, sir." Richard raised one eyebrow, the gesture that had ended negotiations in boardrooms from Chicago to Dallas. "No," he asked. "Then what is it?" Maya looked at the sandwich, then back at him. "It's what I have." The sentence landed quietly, without drama, without begging, and somehow that made it heavier. Principal Hayes stepped closer, ready to rescue the moment, but Maya was not finished. She folded the wax paper back over the sandwich with careful hands and said, "And it's not for you to laugh at." Somewhere behind Richard, a camera clicked once, then stopped. The sound seemed to irritate him. He turned slightly, aware again of the donors, the parents, the board members, the room full of witnesses. His jaw tightened. Men-like. Richard Whitmore did not apologize in public unless their lawyers advised it. Instead, he smiled, the smooth corporate smile printed on magazine covers and annual reports. "I admire confidence," he said, "even when it comes from a lunchbox." This time, no one laughed. Maya lowered her eyes, not in defeat, but in decision. She closed the lunchbox, pressed the cracked latch until it caught, and slid it gently into her backpack. The movement was so deliberate that Richard noticed it despite himself. She had not taken a single bite. Around them, servers began moving again, trying to restart the luncheon as if the room had not cracked down the middle. Plates arrived with grilled chicken, salad, warm rolls, and little squares of butter shaped like flowers. Richard was guided toward the podium by smiling administrators, but as he began his prepared speech about feeding America's future, his eyes kept drifting back to the end of the third table. Maya sat straight with her hands folded in her lap. Her plate remained untouched except for the unopened milk carton beside it. When the applause came, she did not clap. She looked toward the tall windows where afternoon light poured across the floor in long golden bars, and she seemed to be waiting for something beyond the walls of St. Gabriel Academy. Richard told himself he was annoyed because children should be taught manners. He told himself the girl had embarrassed him. He told himself the moment would pass as soon as the check was handed over and the photographers got what they came for. But 20 minutes later, after the donors stood for pictures and the principal thanked him 3 times, Richard saw Maya slip out of the side door with her backpack held close against her chest. No teacher followed. No friend walked beside her. The blue lunchbox made a small square shape beneath the worn fabric of her bag. Richard paused near the dessert table, watching through the glass as she crossed the courtyard alone, moving past the manicured hedges, past the school crest carved in stone, past the front entrance where black SUVs waited for children whose lunches had never been questioned. She did not head toward the buses. She did not head toward the parent pickup line. Instead, she turned toward the narrow service gate behind the chapel, the one that opened onto the city streets beyond the school's polished world. Richard's driver, Calvin, appeared beside him holding his coat. "Car's ready, sir." Richard did not move. Outside, Maya stopped under the iron archway and looked back once, not toward him, not toward the cameras, but toward the building as if measuring the distance between what people promised and what they actually did. Then she stepped through the gate and disappeared from view. Richard's hand closed slowly around the stem of his untouched water glass. For reasons he could not name and did not want to examine, the image of that blue lunchbox stayed with him. Not the sandwich, not the apples, the way she had protected it, the way she had said, "It's what I have," as if those 5 words were not an excuse, but a boundary. "Calvin," Richard said at last, his voice lower now. "Pull the car around to the side street." Calvin blinked. "The side street, sir?" Richard kept his eyes on the gate. "Yes." He picked up his coat, the expensive wool sliding over his arm like a shadow. "And keep a respectful distance." Outside, the autumn air had sharpened, carrying the smell of rain and roasted chestnuts from a vendor 2 blocks away. Richard stepped into the back of the SUV, and as the door closed, the warm silence of leather and tinted glass wrapped around him. Through the windshield, he saw Maya walking quickly along the sidewalk, her small sneakers tapping over fallen leaves, her backpack bouncing lightly with each step. She looked like any child going home from school, except she was not going home. Richard knew it before the car even began to move. Something about the way she held that bag told him the lunch had a destination, and for the first time all day, the billionaire who had built his fortune feeding millions wondered who a hungry little girl could possibly be saving her meal for. The black SUV rolled quietly through the afternoon traffic, keeping nearly half a block between itself and the little girl. Richard Whitmore sat in the back seat with one hand resting on the leather armrest and the other loosely holding a pair of reading glasses he had not used in months. Outside, Manhattan moved with its usual rhythm. Delivery trucks stopped beside restaurants. Office workers hurried toward late meetings. Street vendors called out prices for roasted nuts and hot pretzels. Yet Richard found himself paying attention to only one person. Maya Brooks walked steadily along the sidewalk with her backpack held against her shoulder. She did not wander. She did not stop to look into store windows. She moved with purpose. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Children were supposed to be unpredictable. Children were supposed to chase distractions. Maya looked like someone carrying out a responsibility. Calvin glanced at the rearview mirror. "Sir, should I continue?" Richard hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, just do not get close enough to make her uncomfortable." Calvin nodded. The SUV remained at a respectful distance. Maya crossed 2 intersections and continued south. The expensive private school disappeared behind them, replaced by older brick buildings, family-owned shops, and narrow streets lined with maple trees whose leaves had begun turning gold. Richard watched as she passed a bakery. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the slightly open window of the vehicle. For a brief moment, he expected her to stop. Any hungry child would have. Instead, she kept walking. 10 minutes later, she reached a small public park squeezed between a church and a row of apartment buildings. Children played near a swing set. A few seniors sat on benches enjoying the mild autumn afternoon. Maya entered the park and sat alone at a weathered picnic table beneath a large oak tree. Richard frowned. She stopped, Calvin observed. Looks that way. Richard expected her to finally eat. Instead, Maya removed the blue lunchbox from her backpack and carefully opened it. The cracked latch clicked softly. She looked at the sandwich for several seconds. Then she took the carton of milk and set it aside. The apple slices followed. She rearranged everything with remarkable care, almost like someone setting a table for a guest. Richard leaned forward. Slightly. What is she doing? Calvin asked. Richard did not answer because he did not know. A few moments later, an elderly woman approached the picnic table, pushing a small folding cart filled with groceries. Maya immediately stood up and smiled. The woman smiled back. They exchanged a few words Richard could not hear. Then Maya reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded paper napkin. She placed the napkin beside the sandwich and offered it to the woman. The elderly woman touched Maya's shoulder affectionately before continuing across the park. Maya sat back down. The lunch remained untouched. Richard felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was not guilt. At least not yet. It was curiosity mixed with discomfort. Why had she prepared the food as if someone else were expected? The answer arrived 20 minutes later. A church bell rang once in the distance. Maya immediately stood and closed the lunchbox. She checked the time on a small pink watch around her wrist. Then she left the park and headed toward the church beside it. The building was modest, built from dark stone that showed its age. A wooden cross stood near the entrance. Maya walked around the side of the church rather than entering through the front doors. Richard opened the SUV door before Calvin could stop him. Sir, stay here. You want to walk? I just want to understand something. The billionaire stepped onto the sidewalk. The afternoon air felt cooler now. He adjusted his coat and followed at a distance. Maya disappeared behind the church. Richard slowed his pace, careful not to startle her. As he reached the corner of the building, he finally saw where she had gone. Behind the church stood a small community garden surrounded by wooden fencing. Several raised beds contained late-season vegetables. A few folding chairs sat beneath a canopy near a storage shed. Maya crossed the garden carrying the lunchbox in both hands. Her face brightened in a way Richard had not seen all day. It was not the smile of a child receiving something. It was the smile of a child about to give something away. Richard stopped beside the fence and watched. Maya continued toward the far end of the garden, where someone waited just beyond his line of sight. He could not yet see the person. He could only hear a warm, elderly voice drifting through the autumn air. There you are, little chef, the voice called gently. Maya laughed. It was the first time Richard had heard her laugh. The sound was light and genuine, and somehow it struck him harder than any criticism could have. She hurried forward, clutching the blue lunchbox against her chest. Richard remained still behind the fence, his attention fixed on the unseen figure ahead, completely unaware that within the next few minutes he was about to discover a truth far more valuable than anything printed in the glossy brochures carrying his name. Richard remained motionless beside the fence. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the yellow leaves overhead, painting the community garden in shades of gold and amber. For a moment, the city noise seemed far away. The traffic, the sirens, the endless rush of Manhattan faded behind the simple scene unfolding before him. Maya reached a wooden bench near the far corner of the garden where an elderly man sat wearing a faded brown jacket and a knitted cap. His silver beard was neatly trimmed, and despite the age in his face, his eyes carried a warmth that immediately softened Maya's expression. She set the blue lunchbox carefully on the bench between them. I saved the soft part for you, she said proudly. The old man smiled as though she had just handed him something priceless. Then I am the luckiest man in New York City. Maya giggled and opened the lunchbox. She unwrapped the sandwich with the care of a chef presenting a meal in an expensive restaurant. Richard watched her divide the sandwich into 2 uneven pieces. She pushed the larger half toward the old man and kept the smaller piece for herself. Then she handed him the milk carton. You need this more than me, she said. That is not how sharing works. the man replied gently. Sharing means we both get something. Maya thought for a second, then nodded. She took a tiny sip before passing the carton back to him. The old man laughed softly. There. Now it is official. Richard felt something uncomfortable stirring inside him. At the academy, he had seen only a poor lunch. Standing here, he saw a gift. Maya was not protecting that meal because it was all she had. She was protecting it because it belonged to someone she cared about. The realization settled heavily in his chest. The old man took a bite of the sandwich and closed his eyes briefly. Perfect, he declared. You always say that. Because it is always true. Maya swung her feet beneath the bench. I almost got in trouble today. Only almost. A billionaire laughed at my lunch. The old man's smile faded. That sounds like a sad thing for a billionaire to do. Maya shrugged. Maybe he was having a bad day. Richard blinked. The response caught him completely off guard. She was defending him. After everything he had said, she was still willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. The old man studied her face carefully. Or maybe he forgot something important. Maya tilted her head. Like what? Like the difference between looking and seeing. For a moment, neither spoke. A breeze rustled through the garden. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes tinkled softly. Then Maya reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded paper bag. I brought extra apple slices today. The old man's eyes widened dramatically. Extra? 3 of them. 3 whole slices. Do not get too excited. I cannot help it. Maya laughed again. Richard found himself staring. At the academy, she had seemed quiet, guarded, almost invisible. Here she was completely different. Here she was simply a child sharing an afternoon with someone she trusted. The old man finished another bite of sandwich before glancing toward the church building. Your mother doing all right? Maya nodded. She worked late last night, but she is okay. Still at the hospital cafeteria? Yes. The old man smiled. She always worked harder than anyone else. Richard frowned slightly. The conversation felt familiar somehow, though he could not place why. The old man leaned back against the bench. You know, one day you are going to stop bringing me your lunch. Maya immediately shook her head. No chance. One day you will be too busy. Nope. One day you will. Become a famous doctor or lawyer. Still nope. What if you become president? Maya considered that carefully. Then I will have someone deliver lunch. The old man burst into laughter. The sound echoed through the garden. Even Richard found himself fighting the urge to smile. Then the old man turned slightly, and for the first time the sunlight struck his face clearly. Richard froze. His heartbeat slowed. Every muscle in his body seemed to lock in place. The face was older now. The hair was gray, the shoulders slightly stooped. But he knew that face. He knew it instantly. Memories rushed back from more than a decade earlier. Corporate meetings, newspaper headlines, internal investigations, a kitchen uniform, a name attached to a scandal that had nearly damaged Whitmore Foods. Richard stared through the fence in disbelief. The elderly man sitting beside Maya was Walter Green. And suddenly the comfortable story Richard had told himself for 12 years began to crack. Richard gripped the wooden fence so tightly that the cool grain pressed into his palm. Walter Green. The name echoed through his mind like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. 12 years earlier, Walter had been one of the most respected executive chefs in Whitmore Foods. His recipes had appeared in magazines. His training program had launched dozens of careers. Employees spoke about him with admiration. Then came the contamination scandal that nearly cost the company millions. Investors demanded answers. Reporters demanded names. Lawyers demanded action. And Richard, determined to protect the corporation he had spent decades building, had signed the recommendation placed on his desk. Walter Green had been blamed. Walter Green had been dismissed. Walter Green had disappeared. At the time, Richard never questioned the conclusion. He had trusted reports, trusted executives, trusted a process designed to move quickly. Standing beside the garden fence, he realized he had never once spoken directly to the man whose life had changed because of a signature. Maya continued chatting happily beside the bench, unaware of the storm building inside the Billionaire. Miss Carter gave me an A on my science project, she said proudly. Walter placed a hand over his heart. An A? Then I suppose I should ask for your autograph before you become famous. Maya rolled her eyes. You say that every time. Because every time it becomes more true. Walter smiled. The smile carried no bitterness, no resentment, no trace of anger. Richard found that almost impossible to understand. If their positions had been reversed, he doubted he would have been so generous. Maya reached into her backpack again and removed a folded worksheet covered with colorful drawings. Walter studied every page carefully, nodding as though he were reviewing plans for a space mission. "Excellent work," he declared. "Your volcano looks very convincing." "It is not a volcano." "No, it is a mountain ecosystem." Walter placed a hand dramatically over his forehead. "My mistake. I clearly need further education." Maya laughed so hard that she nearly dropped her paper. Richard felt another uncomfortable tug inside his chest. The old man was giving her something valuable. Not money, not gifts. Attention, the kind that could not be purchased. The kind many children never received enough of. As the afternoon sunlight softened, several volunteers emerged from the church carrying boxes of donated food. Walter immediately stood. Despite his age, he moved with surprising energy. "Looks like my shift is starting." Maya jumped up beside him. "Can I help?" "Only if you promise not to organize everything better than I do." "No promises." Together they walked toward the volunteers. Richard watched in silence. Walter greeted every person by name. He carried boxes, arranged supplies, and welcomed visitors with the same warm smile. No one treated him like a burden. No one looked at him with pity. He belonged there. One of the volunteers handed Walter a clipboard. Another asked his opinion about meal planning for the weekend community dinner. Walter answered thoughtfully. People listened, respected him, trusted him. Richard suddenly realized something unsettling. The old chef had rebuilt a life without the corporation that once defined him. Yet somehow that realization did not make Richard feel relieved. It made him feel smaller. A few minutes later, Maya helped stack canned goods beside a folding table. Walter watched proudly. "You know," one volunteer said, "that little girl has been coming here almost every afternoon for months." Walter smiled. "I know. Rain or shine. I know. Sometimes she brings her entire lunch." Walter's expression softened. "I know that too." Richard looked away. The words landed harder than they should have. Months. This had not been a one-time act of kindness. It was a commitment, a habit, a promise kept repeatedly by a child who possessed far less than the adults around her. The church bell rang again, marking the hour. Maya checked her pink watch and sighed. "I need to go." Walter nodded. "Your mother will worry." Maya hugged him quickly. "See you tomorrow. I will be right here." "Same sandwich day?" "Hopefully." "Same apple slices?" "If I am lucky." Maya grinned. Then she started toward the garden gate. As she passed through the opening in the fence, her eyes suddenly widened. She stopped walking. Richard followed her gaze. For a brief second, neither spoke. The distance between them could not have been more than 15 feet. The little girl stared directly at him. The billionaire who had mocked her lunch stood frozen beneath the golden leaves of the garden. Maya's smile faded. Not into fear, not into anger, into confusion. She looked from Richard to Walter and back again. The afternoon breeze stirred the branches overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed faintly before disappearing into the city noise. Walter turned to see what had caught her attention. The moment his eyes landed on Richard Whitmore, the color drained from the old chef's face. The smile vanished. The garden suddenly felt very quiet. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The golden afternoon light continued to drift across the garden, but the warmth seemed to disappear from the air. Walter Green stared at Richard Whitmore as though he had seen a ghost step out of an old photograph. Maya looked between them, sensing something she could not yet understand. Richard was the first to speak. "Walter." The name came out quieter than he intended. Walter's jaw tightened slightly. "Mr. Whitmore." Neither man looked away. Years of history stood silently between them. Maya shifted her backpack higher on her shoulder. "You know each other?" Walter kept his eyes on Richard. "A long time ago." Richard swallowed. The answer felt painfully incomplete. A long time ago, Walter had worked for him. A long time ago, Richard had trusted paperwork more than people. A long time ago, a signature had altered the direction of another man's life. Maya sensed the tension immediately. "Did you work together?" she asked. Walter finally turned toward her and forced a gentle smile. "Something like that." Richard wanted to say more. He wanted to explain. He wanted to ask questions that had never seemed important until now. But standing in front of Maya, he suddenly realized how little he actually knew. He knew quarterly earnings. He knew market forecasts. He knew acquisition strategies. Yet he did not know what happened to Walter after he disappeared from Whitmore Foods. He did not know why a little girl brought him lunch every day. He did not know why the sight of that blue lunchbox now made him feel ashamed. Maya looked at Richard carefully. "Did you follow me?" The question was simple and direct. Richard could not remember the last time anyone had asked him something without fear or hesitation. "Yes," he admitted. Maya blinked. "Why?" Richard searched for an answer that would not sound foolish. "I wanted to understand." "Understand what?" "Why you were protecting that lunch." Maya glanced at Walter. The old chef remained silent. After a moment, she looked back at Richard. "And now?" Richard lowered his eyes briefly. "Now I think I understand a little more than I did this morning." The honesty surprised even him. Maya studied his face as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Before she could respond, one of the church volunteers called Walter's name from across the garden. Several new boxes of supplies had arrived. Walter nodded toward the volunteer. "I should help with that." He turned toward Maya. "You need to get home before your mother worries." Maya nodded. Then she looked at Richard again. "You should probably go too." There was no anger in her voice. Somehow that made the words harder to hear. Richard gave a small nod. "You are probably right." Maya started walking toward the gate. After a few steps, she stopped and looked back. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Yes." "You said my lunch was a warning sign." Richard felt heat rise into his face. Maya continued. "Maybe it was." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She thought for a moment. "Maybe it was warning you not to judge people before you know their story." The words were spoken gently, not as an insult, not as revenge, simply as truth. Richard stood speechless. Maya offered a small smile and walked away. The gate closed softly behind her. For a while, Richard remained where he was. The sounds of the garden returned around him. Volunteers organizing supplies, leaves rustling overhead, distant traffic beyond the church walls. Walter approached slowly once his task was finished. Neither man spoke immediately. Finally, Walter folded his arms. "You have not changed much." Richard managed a humorless smile. "I'm not sure that is a compliment." "It is not." The response carried no hostility, only honesty. Richard nodded. "Fair enough." Another silence followed. Walter looked toward the gate where Maya had disappeared. "She is a remarkable kid." She is. "She reminds me that kindness is still alive in this city." Richard watched the same gate. "How long has she been bringing you lunch?" Walter smiled softly. "Almost 8 months." Richard stared at him. 8 months. Every school day. Why? Walter looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Because she cares." Richard shook his head. "There has to be more to it than that." Walter's expression softened. "There is." He looked toward the church building where the evening sunlight reflected against the stained glass windows. "Her mother used to work in a diner near my apartment. Years ago, when times were hard for her, I made sure she and Maya never left hungry." Richard listened carefully. Walter continued. "I never thought much about it. A bowl of soup, a sandwich, a little kindness." He smiled faintly. Apparently Maya thought differently. Richard felt a weight settle deeper inside his chest. A child had remembered a kindness for years. A child had repaid it one lunch at a time. Meanwhile, he had forgotten the human beings hidden behind reports and headlines. Walter studied him quietly. "You look troubled." Richard laughed softly. "That obvious?" "Very." The old chef adjusted his jacket. "Good." Richard raised an eyebrow. Walter nodded toward the church. "Sometimes being troubled is the first step toward seeing clearly." The words lingered in the cooling autumn air. As the sun dipped lower behind the rooftops, Richard Whitmore stood in the community garden feeling something unfamiliar. It was not defeat. It was not embarrassment. It was the uncomfortable beginning of self-awareness. And for the first time in many years, the billionaire was no longer thinking about his company, his reputation, or his next business deal. He was thinking about a little girl, a blue lunchbox, and a debt he had never realized he owed. That evening, Manhattan glittered beneath a blanket of lights, but Richard Whitmore barely noticed. His penthouse overlooked the Hudson River, offering a view people paid fortunes to admire. Tonight, the windows felt like mirrors. Everywhere he looked, he saw reflections of choices he had made years ago. A perfectly prepared dinner sat untouched on the dining table. A chef had spent hours creating the meal. Richard stared at it for less than 10 seconds before walking away. The image that remained in his mind was not the expensive food before him. It was half of a peanut butter sandwich resting inside a cracked blue lunchbox. He loosened his tie and stepped into his private study. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Awards, framed magazine covers, and photographs documenting decades of success filled the room. Normally the space brought him comfort. Tonight it felt crowded. He sat behind his desk and opened his laptop. For several moments his fingers hovered above the keyboard. Then he typed 2 words. Walter Green. Hundreds of files appeared. Corporate records. Archived reports. Internal investigations. Newspaper articles. Most had not been opened in years. Richard clicked the oldest folder. The contamination scandal. The event that had nearly shaken Whitmore Foods off its foundation. He remembered the panic. Investors demanding immediate answers. Lawyers warning of lawsuits. Executives insisting swift action was necessary. Back then, he had been proud of moving quickly. Now he wondered what speed had cost. He opened report after report. At first, everything appeared exactly as he remembered. Witness statements. Inspection summaries. Internal recommendations. Then he noticed something unusual. A note attached to an email chain. A follow-up request marked pending. Another document labeled incomplete. Richard frowned. He opened additional files. The deeper he searched, the more questions appeared. Important interviews had never been finalized. Certain findings had been reviewed, but never fully verified. Details that should have triggered further investigation had simply disappeared beneath deadlines and pressure. His stomach tightened. Around midnight, he picked up the phone. Calvin. His driver answered sleepily. Yes, sir. I need a favor. Of course. Tomorrow morning, find out everything you can about Walter Green after he left Whitmore Foods. There was a brief pause. Everything, sir? Richard looked out at the dark river. Everything. The next morning arrived gray and cool. At St. Gabriel Academy, Maya sat through math class, science class, and reading exercises, but her thoughts kept drifting toward the garden. She wondered whether Walter liked the apple slices. She wondered if he remembered to wear his warmer jacket. Mostly she wondered why the billionaire had looked so different at the church. At school he had seemed untouchable. At the garden he had seemed almost lost. During lunch, she opened her new paper bag and carefully examined its contents. Turkey sandwich. Apple slices. Milk. She smiled. Perfect. Across town, Richard spent the morning reviewing records. Shortly before noon, Calvin entered the office carrying a thick folder. I found what I could. Richard accepted it immediately. The file revealed a story he had never known. After leaving Whitmore Foods, Walter struggled to find work. Yet every reference from former co-workers praised his character. Community. Kitchens welcomed him. Churches trusted him. Neighborhood programs relied on him. Again and again, the same pattern appeared. Wherever Walter went, he fed people, taught people, helped people. Richard turned another page. A photograph slipped from the folder. It showed Walter standing beside a younger woman wearing a cafeteria uniform. Beside them stood a little girl no older than 4 years old, smiling with missing front teeth. Richard recognized her instantly. Maya. He stared at the picture for a long time. Attached beneath it was a handwritten note from a community fundraiser. Walter Green helped support local families during difficult times. Special thanks for mentoring single parents and providing meals when resources were limited. Richard leaned back slowly. Suddenly the pieces began fitting together. Years ago, Walter had helped Maya's mother when nobody else did. He had given food without expecting repayment, kindness without publicity, generosity without cameras. And now a little girl was honoring that kindness one lunch at a time. Richard closed his eyes. For decades, he had measured value through numbers, revenue, growth, market share. Yet the most meaningful investment he had witnessed all year came from an 8-year-old child sharing half a sandwich. His phone buzzed. Another executive meeting reminder. Another presentation. Another opportunity to discuss profits and expansion. Richard canceled it with a single click. Then he picked up the photograph again and studied the smiling faces. For the first time, he no longer wanted to know what happened to the company 12 years ago. He wanted to know what happened to the people. The following afternoon, a cold wind swept between the buildings of Manhattan, carrying the scent of rain that had not yet fallen. Richard Whitmore stood beside the tall windows of his corporate headquarters, looking down at the streets 40 floors below. Employees moved through the lobby carrying laptops and coffee cups. Meetings filled conference rooms. Deals were negotiated. Deadlines approached. Everything inside the company continued exactly as it had the day before. Yet Richard felt as though he had stepped into a different world. He had spent the entire morning reviewing records connected to the old investigation. The deeper he searched, the more uncomfortable the truth became. Important recommendations had been ignored. Follow-up interviews had been delayed. Decisions had been rushed. The evidence that justified Walter Green's dismissal had never been as solid as Richard remembered. Back then, everyone had been focused on protecting the company. No one had stopped long enough to protect the man. Richard closed another file and rubbed his forehead. Across his desk sat Caroline Mercer, the company's chief legal officer. She had worked beside him for nearly 15 years and rarely looked surprised. Today was an exception. "You canceled 3 board meetings," she said carefully. "You have spent 2 days reviewing a 12-year-old case." Richard nodded. "I know. May I ask why?" He turned toward the window again. "Because I think we got it wrong." Silence filled the office. Caroline studied him. "That is a serious statement." "It should be." She opened a folder and glanced through several pages. "Even if mistakes were made, there may not be anything we can change now." Richard thought about the community garden. He thought about Walter laughing over apple slices. He thought about Maya carefully dividing a sandwich in half. "Maybe not," he said quietly, "but I am going to try." Meanwhile, several miles away, Maya sat in the church garden finishing her homework beside Walter. The old chef wore a heavier coat today. Gray clouds gathered overhead, turning the afternoon sky the color of steel. "You keep looking at the gate," Walter observed. Maya shrugged. "Do I?" "Every 30 seconds. She smiled sheepishly. "Maybe." Walter folded his newspaper. "Expecting someone?" Maya hesitated. "Maybe the billionaire." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. Not because I like him. Of course not. And not because I want anything. Naturally." Maya crossed her arms. "You are making fun of me." Walter laughed softly. "A little." She stared toward the entrance again. He seemed different. Walter followed her gaze. "People can change. Even rich people. Especially rich people. Sometimes they simply need a reason." Maya considered that answer. Before she could respond, a familiar black SUV turned slowly onto the street beside the church. Her eyes widened. Walter noticed immediately. "Speak of the devil. You are not supposed to call people that." "Fair point." The vehicle parked along the curb. Richard stepped out carrying a plain cardboard box. No cameras followed him. No assistants. No reporters. Just the billionaire and a box tucked beneath one arm. Maya stood up. Walter remained seated, watching quietly. Richard approached the garden gate and stopped. For the first time in years, he seemed uncertain of what to say. "Good afternoon," he finally managed. Maya looked at the box. "What is that?" Richard glanced down. "Something I thought belonged here." He carried it to the picnic table and carefully set it down. Walter frowned slightly. "What is inside?" Richard opened the flaps. Several old photographs rested on top. Beneath them were newspaper clippings, certificates, employee awards, and framed recognition plaques. Walter stared. "Where did you find those?" "Company archives." Richard lifted one of the plaques. It read Executive Culinary Excellence Award. Walter's name gleamed beneath a layer of dust. The old chef looked speechless. "I thought they were destroyed." Richard swallowed. "They should have been returned years ago." Walter slowly reached for the plaque. His fingers traced the engraved letters. Maya looked from one man to the other. She sensed the importance even if she did not fully understand it. Richard took a deep breath. "I have spent 2 days reviewing what happened." Walter remained silent. "And the more I read, the less proud I am of my decisions." The wind rustled through the garden. Somewhere beyond the church walls, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Richard looked directly at Walter. "I cannot change the past." His voice was steady but sincere. "But I am beginning to understand it. And that understanding is long overdue." Walter held the plaque against his chest for a moment. Then he looked at Maya. The little girl sat quietly, listening to every word. The old chef smiled faintly. "Funny thing about understanding," he said. "Sometimes it arrives years late." Richard nodded. "I know." Walter glanced toward the darkening sky. "The important question is whether it stays." Rain arrived shortly after Richard left the garden. It began as a light mist drifting across the city and gradually turned into a steady autumn shower that painted the sidewalk silver. That night, Richard remained in his office long after most employees had gone home. Floor after floor of the Whitmore Foods headquarters went dark until only a few lights remained glowing near the executive wing. On his desk sat the old photographs from the cardboard box. Beside them rested dozens of newly printed documents gathered from company archives. Richard reviewed each page carefully. The story became clearer with every file. Walter Green had not failed the company. The company had failed Walter Green. Several internal recommendations that might have protected him had been ignored during the rush to reassure investors. Critical findings had never reached the final review meeting. Decisions had been driven by fear rather than truth. Richard leaned back in his chair and stared at the city skyline. For years he had believed leadership meant acting quickly. Now he understood that leadership also required the courage to slow down long enough to see people clearly. Early the next morning, he called an emergency executive session. By 9 o'clock, senior leadership filled the conference room. Screens glowed. Coffee cups steamed. Confused executives exchanged nervous looks. Richard rarely called meetings without advance notice. When he entered, the room fell silent. He carried a thin folder instead of the usual presentation materials. "Good morning," he said. "Today we are going to discuss a mistake." Several eyebrows lifted immediately. Richard opened the folder. 12 years ago, this company mishandled the investigation involving Walter Green. No one spoke. Some remembered the case. Others knew only fragments of the story. Richard continued. "I spent the last several days reviewing the records personally. Important facts were overlooked. Incomplete conclusions became permanent decisions. As chief executive officer at the time, the responsibility ultimately belonged to me." The room remained silent. A few executives shifted uneasily. Richard had spent decades building a reputation for confidence and certainty. Hearing him acknowledge fault felt almost unreal. "What happens now?" one board member finally asked. Richard looked around the room. "Now we correct what can still be corrected." That afternoon, preparations began. Human resources gathered records. Legal teams reviewed procedures. Communications staff drafted statements. For the first time in years, an entire corporate machine moved not to protect a reputation, but to restore one. Across town, Maya sat beneath the church canopy, finishing a reading assignment while Walter organized supplies for the weekend meal program. The rain had stopped, leaving tiny drops of water clinging to the garden leaves like glass beads. "You are smiling," Maya observed. Walter looked up from a clipboard. "Am I?" "A lot. Maybe I am having a good day." Maya studied him suspiciously. "Something happened." Walter laughed softly. "You sound like a detective." "I am a detective." Before Walter could answer, a volunteer approached carrying a tablet. "Walter, I think you should see this." The volunteer turned the screen around. A headline from a local business publication filled the display. "Whitmore Foods announces formal review of historic executive decision." Walter stared for several seconds. Maya leaned closer. "Is that about you?" Walter did not answer immediately. His eyes moved slowly across the article. Finally he nodded. "I think it might be." Later that evening, Richard arrived at the garden again. This time he carried no box. He brought no documents. Only himself. Maya spotted him first. "You came back." Richard smiled faintly. "I said I was trying to understand." "Still trying?" "Very much." Walter approached from the opposite side of the garden. The old chef looked tired but calm. "I read the announcement." Richard nodded. "Then you know." Walter folded his arms. "You are reopening everything." "Yes." "That will attract attention." "Probably." Walter looked toward the church. "People do not usually volunteer for embarrassment." Richard followed his gaze. "Maybe that is part of the problem." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Richard took a deep breath. "I spent years protecting my image." He looked directly at Walter. "Meanwhile, a little girl with a cracked lunchbox spent 8 months protecting your dignity." The words hung quietly between them. Maya lowered her eyes, suddenly shy. Walter smiled at her. "She has always been good at that." Richard nodded slowly. "Better than most adults I know." The evening sun finally broke through the clouds, casting warm light across the garden. For the first time since this journey began, the distance between the billionaire and the old chef felt smaller. Not gone. Not yet. But smaller. And as Maya sat beside the picnic table listening to the conversation, she realized something important. The man who had laughed at her lunch was no longer the same man standing before them now. 3 weeks later, the auditorium at St. Gabriel Academy was filled beyond capacity. Parents occupied every seat. Students lined the aisles. Teachers stood along the walls. Reporters had gathered near the back, though the atmosphere felt very different from the polished donor luncheon that had taken place earlier that month. There were no giant banners celebrating corporate generosity, no oversized checks waiting beside a podium. The focus of the room rested on something much simpler: truth. Maya sat in the second row beside her mother, Angela Brooks. Her blue lunchbox rested on her lap. The cracked latch had recently been repaired, but she still carried it everywhere. Beside her sat Walter Green, wearing a navy blazer that had been donated by one of the church volunteers. He looked uncomfortable with the attention, which only made Maya smile. On stage, Richard Whitmore stood alone behind a wooden podium. The room quieted. For a moment, he simply looked out at the crowd. Then he began. Most people assume success means never making mistakes. His voice carried clearly through the auditorium. I spent many years believing that myself. The truth is much less comfortable. The audience listened carefully. Richard continued. 12 years ago, decisions were made inside my company that affected the life of a good man. Those decisions were based on incomplete information and rushed conclusions. As the leader of that company, the responsibility was mine. A silence settled over the room. No one interrupted. No one looked away. Richard turned toward Walter. Mr. Walter Green deserved better. Walter lowered his eyes. Richard continued. After a full independent review, Whitmore Foods has formally cleared his record. Effective immediately, all previous findings connected to that investigation have been withdrawn. A wave of murmurs spread through the audience. Maya's eyes widened. Angela reached for her daughter's hand. Richard was not finished. Furthermore, Whitmore Foods will establish the Walter Green Culinary Fellowship, a program supporting community food leaders throughout New York City. This time applause erupted across the auditorium. Walter looked genuinely stunned. He shook his head slowly as though he could not quite believe what he was hearing. Richard smiled faintly. And there is one more thing. The applause faded. Richard glanced toward the second row. Several weeks ago, I visited this school and made a comment about a child's lunch. Maya immediately knew where this was going. Her cheeks turned pink. I judged something before I understood it, Richard said. I looked at a meal and saw scarcity. I looked at a lunchbox and saw a problem. What I failed to see was generosity. He stepped away from the podium and walked toward the front edge of the stage. That lunch represented gratitude, loyalty, character. It carried more value than many things money can buy. Every eye in the room shifted toward Maya. She wished she could disappear beneath her chair. Richard smiled. Maya Brooks taught me a lesson that day. She reminded me that dignity does not come from wealth. It comes from how we treat people. The audience rose to its feet. The applause grew louder. Maya covered her face with both hands, embarrassed by the attention. Walter laughed softly beside her. Angela wrapped an arm around her shoulders. When the applause finally settled, Richard invited Walter onto the stage. The old chef hesitated before standing. The crowd applauded again as he walked forward. Richard handed him a framed certificate restoring his professional recognition. Then, to everyone's surprise, the billionaire stepped back and allowed Walter to stand at the center. This belongs to you, Richard said quietly. Walter looked across the audience. His eyes stopped on Maya. No, he replied gently. It belongs to all of us. Later that afternoon, after the reporters departed and the crowd dispersed, the three of them found themselves back at the church garden. The air carried the scent of fallen leaves. The sunlight glowed warm and golden through the trees. Volunteers prepared soup for the evening meal program. Children laughed near the garden fence. Life moved forward. Maya sat at the picnic table with her blue lunchbox open between them. Inside rested 3 sandwiches. 3? Walter asked. I planned ahead. Richard laughed. Smart strategy. Maya handed one sandwich to Walter and another to Richard. Now everybody gets one. Walter accepted his sandwich with a smile. Richard looked down at the simple meal in his hands. Bread, peanut butter, apple slices. Nothing extraordinary. Yet somehow it felt more meaningful than any dinner he had attended in years. They ate together beneath the autumn sky while the city moved around them. No photographers. No speeches. No headlines. Just 3 people sharing a meal. After a while, Maya looked at Richard. Do you still think it was a warning sign? Richard glanced at the lunchbox and smiled. Yes. Maya raised an eyebrow. Really? He nodded. It warned me that I had forgotten something important. Walter chuckled softly. And what was that? Richard looked at both of them before answering. That a full table means nothing if your heart has no room for anyone else. The garden grew quiet. Leaves drifted slowly from the trees. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang across the neighborhood. And for the first time in a very long time, Richard Whitmore felt richer than he had ever been.